He is an accomplished writer with his latest book, The Code, out now. Highly recommend you get it tonight. Please welcome Mr. Shaun Tomson. And we have some wonderful intern in the back who's running the PowerPoint, so I'm going to be snapping my fingers to switch to the next slide. And I wanted to start with just a little thing about Shaun's tube riding. We can admire his skills. Can we dim the lights possibly just briefly? Is that possible? It's very important that we see his tube riding skills. It's really, you have no idea. I just want to embarrass him a little bit more. There we go. Can we get to the next slide and let's hit play? You won't be able to hear the audio though, I'm sorry. They're just talking about how awesome he is. This is now off the wall here, Shaun. And this is a Spider Murphy board. Now this board, it had a very unique rocker, didn't it?
Well, this board was a 7-footer shape by an old friend of mine called Spider Murphy, and at the time it was called a single to double concave, which was kind of a revolutionary design. Everyone was riding flats and V-bottoms, so he had this idea that you'd be able to accelerate by driving forward on the front foot with a concave. You can see the board had a lot of speed, so that sort of, I developed the technique around the board. It was interesting. The board made me do that. And I owed all to the board. But this was in 1975. I think I was 19 years old at Off the Wall, which was a place that pretty much only the South Africans and Aussies used to surf. The Hawaiian guys didn't really think too much of the wave. But now it's very popular and very crowded. But back then, we just pretty much had it to ourselves. It was almost like a little, our own little paradise on the beautiful island of Hawaii. It was some good times.
Now, there's a real unique thing, though, that happened to the rocker of that board before you left for Hawaii. How did he put the rock... Now, some of you, if you're not familiar with rocker, that's the curve of the board. And, you know, back then, a lot of them were very straight, and it was very difficult to take off very late in the waves. And Spider did a really interesting thing to install that rocker.
Yes, what he did is... this is actually called riding on the foam ball, which was sort of a new technique... back then, and the boards had such a perfect rocker that you could actually just ride on the sort of almost like a magic carpet of foam. It was a really wonderful feeling, and the board got the rocker in it because he bent it with some bricks, which was sort of a very primitive African way of doing things. And it just turned out to be a design fluke, and ultimately I think changed the way the boards were ridden, because boards were very straight and flat back then. So it was one of those just innovative flukes.
So let's move on to the next slide, please, Amanda. Shaun the Grommet. So, Shaun, where were your parents from, and how did they get to South Africa?
Well, my father was born in South Africa. He was born from Lithuanian parents who fled the pogroms during the late 18th century. They were Jews, so it wasn't too good to be a Jew in Russia back then. And like many immigrants that came to the United States, his parents ended up in South Africa. And my mom came from England. She was originally born in England and spent the Second World War on the island of Malta, which ended up being the most heavily bombed place in the history of the world. She endured 3,400 air raids, and over a 3-week period, they had 15 million pounds of bombs dropped on them. So she had a kind of a tough some tough teenage years, but ultimately ended up in South Africa and met my dad. And in the bottom left corner there, that was our lives growing up. We spent our lives on the beach, like so many of you travel out to Long Island and spend the summers on the beach. We spent our whole lives on the beach. We were very lucky. My father was a champion swimmer in his youth. You can see that's a photo of my dad up in the far left-hand corner and on the right. And the far left-hand corner, I just made the South African team. I was 14 years old. I was the youngest seed in the team. And in South Africa back then, when you became a member of the national team, it was called becoming a Springbok, which was a great honor in South Africa. You got a green blazer. You can see us wearing the blazers in the bottom right-hand corner there. Looks kind of dorky now, but at the time we were like we were like super proud schoolboys to get our places, and we were on the way there in 1970. I was 14. My cousin Michael was 15. We were on our way to compete in the World Championships in Australia. But my father had a very pure concept when it came to sport. And I think as a young guy, he really instilled this a wonderful notion about what is important in sport. And he used to tell me, and I think back to some of the statements that he made, they were really, I think, profound. And they were really, I think in some ways he foretold the future. And he would say to me, there is nothing worse than someone that cheats at sport. He said, sport is pure and clear. And I think it's a wonderful thing that as a young boy to grow up with that sentiment, that it's not about the win, but it's about how you win. And he would say to me, when you win with honor. When you lose like a man. And when you win like a gentleman. And it was, when you look back on those words, they kind of seem quaint and they kind of seem 19th century. But I think they are very modern thoughts. And I think there's a lot of parents in the room tonight, and I think it's not about the win, but it's the way you win. And we've seen so many great sportsmen. You look what's happening right here in this town. You see the greatest sportsmen in the history of this town, how they've made us all ashamed of themselves and the sport and what they've done. And I think those sentiments, to learn them from a guy like my father when I was young, was a wonderful thing. And this was a person who had his dreams destroyed. When he was about to embark on an Olympic career as one of South Africa's top swimmers, he was out there in the water in Durban, where I was born, on a little wooden surfboard. And out of nowhere, a Zambezi shark came off and nearly ripped his arm off and nearly killed him. It's one of the first recorded incidents of a shark attack on a surfer. And his dreams were gone. But he never lost his passion and love for the ocean, and he never lost his passion and appreciation for the honor of sport and sportsmen. And that's what was instilled in me from a very young age, and I'm very thankful to have had that outlook on sport and life.
It seems like you had a very close relationship with your father, and your father, it seemed like he saw the surfing potential before most people ever did. Like, I mean, surfers were considered dirtbags, in the mid-'60s. I mean, and it wasn't really treated as a professional sport, and he really encouraged you, though. He really kind of pushed you and really encouraged you to do the competitions, and he really believed in it. I just was hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how that not only influenced you, but South African surfing and possibly professional surfing overall.
Yes, I think he had this sort of very simplistic view of sport, and that all sportsmen were equal, and whether you're a rugby player or cricket player or tennis player or swimmer, which were the big sports in South Africa, or whether you're a surfer, there was no differentiation. It wasn't like because you were a surfer, you were a second-class citizen. And I think I had that throughout my career, that we felt as surfers, that obviously in surfing there's that duality. You have the freestyle, soulful, spiritual aspect, and then you have the competitive, discipline, commitment aspect. And while they're separate, they're also intertwined. And as a surfer, as a professional, when you can combine both of those two elements, the spiritual and the competitive element, I think it makes the experience even more profound. So we always had that feeling that we were as good as surfers as any other athletes. And I think the Australians also had that sentiment, that we wanted to see one day that there was a professional aspect to surfing. It wasn't everything about surfing, but certainly it was one aspect that one day we hoped to be able to make a living from it. And we thought that there was nothing, and I still think that there's nothing more honorable to make a living from your passion. And it's rare that one can make a living from your passion. And when you look at the great artists, the ballerina, I mean, whoever it is, art, ballet, whatever it is, these people make this amazing stuff from their passion. And we always thought that there was tremendous honor in that. And you'll see today that you can read in surf media about how, in some ways, if you're making money from sport, you're in some way defiling this incredible spiritual connection with nature. And it's the biggest lot of bullshit. I'll say that straight. I interviewed Kelly Slater after this amazing competitive win. This shows you how some surfers are connected to what is important. So I interviewed him after this amazing competitive win that he had in South Africa against Andy Irons, who's a legend of surfing, and unfortunately, well, we lost Andy a few years ago. So it was about 2 minutes left, and Andy had just had a brilliant wave, and I was doing the commentary for this company called Billabong. So I was watching the heat very intently. Well, they have gotten a lot smaller recently now. Yeah, we can joke about it. I know the crew there. So Andy got this great wave and rode it all the way in and came up the beach with his hands in the air with 2 minutes to go. And I'm watching Andy walk up the beach, had a great wave, and Kelly said it needed a 9.3. So back then, a few years ago, 9.3 was a very difficult score. Today, some judges are handing out 10s with sort of regularity, but back then it was like climbing Mount Everest without oxygen with a pair of board shorts. You know, it was like a massive score. And he's walking up the beach like this, and pumping up the crowd, and I'm going, Kelly's done and dusted. There's no way that he can make it. You know, he's out there and he's just looking totally exhausted. So a set of waves start coming through, and the clock is now ticking down. And Kelly starts paddling over these waves. The first wave comes, and it's like 90 seconds. Paddles over it, and I'm going, wow, that's a great wave. Why is he not taking it? Time ticks down. He paddles over the second wave. Time ticks down. He paddles over the third wave, and I'm going like, what's happening? Kelly Slater, like there's only 3 wave sets at J Bay. The fourth wave is there. He swings around and just, I mean, art. It's like art, carving art. He's like doing these amazing tracks and then ends up with this incredible maneuver, and it's like, well, has he done it? Has he got the 9.3? And the judges go, 9.5, Kelly Slater's the winner, and Andy's on the beach going, shattered. So I speak to Kelly afterwards. I said, Kelly, man, how did you pull that off? It was like amazing. He said, you know, I was out there and I was exhausted. He said, and 2 dolphins swam by me. He said, so I followed the dolphins, and I knew they would take me to where I needed to be. How's that? So here's a guy who's the greatest surfer in the world, who like represents professional surfing, but here's a dude that's connected. And I think the very best surfers are great at competition, but they are as soulful and connected as any surfer you can ever meet. And there's certainly no erosion of the spirit by making money from your passion and from doing what you love.
So, what was your relationship with your mother like? Was she as supportive as your father, or was she the disciplinary, or the person who was?
Yeah, like every Friday night, Saturday morning, synagogue. There's no escape from that. You know, Pesach, whatever. It's like, and my mom was a classic. She wasn't so good on the time. So we would always get to shul, like, you know, when you're like 10, 11, 12, like just as the door closed and the doors would open, and there would the Tomson family be trooping in. Usually our hair's wet from the surfing. But my mom was she was disciplined, and it was, I think, lucky that I had the balance. My dad was about the sport, but she was about the education. And also, she had a really tough childhood in terms of being bombed again, 2 direct hits. A lot of people were killed in Malta. But she never lost her I think, optimism, and she never lost her faith. And she never lost her, I'm sure there's many different religions in this room tonight, and she never lost her love of prayer. Like, prayer is not a Jew thing, a Christian thing, a Catholic thing. It, like, unites us all together. And that's what she would tell us. Pray. Pray. And she told me a story about being in a bomb shelter in Malta. It's a really interesting story. She said the people that lived next door to them were atheists, didn't believe in God. And she was always a very spiritual woman, and still is.